Hey guys, just quickly show you the bandsaw, and ultimately your two pieces that you cut, you want them to be exactly the same. So how I've done that today is I've measured my first piece and I put a mark on the bench, and you can see it there, and I'm going to that mark where my fingernail is, and I'm cutting to that mark. Now you're more than welcome to use that mark as well when you do your cut, but that's just how I'm repeating this, so that it's 320 is what I've measured, but if they all start coming out at 319.75, it doesn't matter. That's accurate. It's a repeatable length, and that's what we want, because those bends, we're trying to get them repeatable as well. So if I start off with two pieces exactly the same, then I'm looking really good at making a nice handle. The other thing that I've done too is I've got hopefully you can see that, I've got a file, and I've just taken the edge of that mild steel round bar off, just to take the edge off so that it doesn't get caught up in my saddle as it's spinning backwards and forwards. Okay guys, so going back to this handle now, after you've cut your two rods at what it says here is 320 6mm mild steel rod. Hopefully that comes into focus for you. Yep. So you're going to cut those two rods on the bandsaw, and then we're going to come over to this Metalcraft. They're calling it a roller bar bender. So you can form steel into an arc by rolling it on this side. Okay, and I could turn that into an arc if I wanted, and roll it through, and you might have done that in year 10. The other thing I can do is I can use this side to create my bends. Now, if we take a look at what it's calling for here, just have to excuse the new bell. It's calling for our first bend being 40mm. Struggling to get focus here on this light, but what it says is the next bend is at 55. So I'm just going to move the camera now so that you get a really good view at what I'm seeing, and talk about the need for this to be really accurate. Now, when I want something accurate, it means that I can repeat it. So I want to be able to repeat the bends that I'm doing over and over again. Now, if I was to use a Nikko or a big fat pen, it's not going to be a very accurate way to do it. If I was to, say, hook my tape measure on and try and mark my first 40mm and then my 55, the thickness of the pen is too thick, and so therefore I can be out a couple of mil every time I do my bend. And there's also, it's very hard to repeat that on a tape measure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a mark on the actual machine, and normally I would just either scratch it in with a scribe or use a black pen. I've put some tape on here. Now, that's just for the purpose of filming. That tape's probably not going to last. It might not even last the demo. We'll see what happens. But there's my first bend. So it's going to be my first bend at 40mm. And so I'm lining that up. And I'm lining, and you can't really see it too well, but I'm going to the thickness of that grey lead pencil, and I'm dividing it in half. I want to be that accurate every single time. So I'm going to pull that through. I'm pulling on this bar here, the one that you're seeing moving, and I'm going to keep going until I get to 90 degrees. And what I've done is there's a bolt in the back here. Now that sets a stop underneath here, and I've set that so that I'm hitting what I think is 90 degrees each time. I might back that out a tiny bit because it's just under 90. There we go. So there's my 90. Bit hard to show that on the camera. Then my next bend is 55. Now I put a ruler, yeah, you can see my tape's already being pulled off. I put a ruler in here before, and the edge of this here to the center of that bend just so happens to be 54 millimeters, which is going to be pretty good. And so I'm going to use that so that I get a repeated bend. Now, the next thing that's super important, and I might even move the camera to show this, I'll just do one bend here now, and then I'll move the camera and get it from another angle, is that this bar has to be running flat on this surface here. So it has the ability to go down or up. We want it to be running flat so that all of our bends happen in the same plane. So I've got that on the edge of my job there. I can just see a bit of daylight poking through, but I'm wanting that to be nice and flat. Now that it is, I'm going to do my 90-degree bend. I'm hitting that stop, which is really good, and I'm starting to form one side of my handle. So the next one, same thing happens again. I put it on that line, and here's where I'm going to move the camera and hopefully show you what's going on. So if I was to squat down beside the bench, I'm going to move this bar now so that it's exaggerated. But if this bar was sitting like that and I was to do my bend, I'm going to have a horrible result. What's going to happen is when the piece comes out, if that was my first bend and then my second bend it wasn't sitting in the same plane, they're going to rock and roll. Okay, they're not all going to be in the same plane and my bends will be out. So hopefully that shows it pretty good. So what we need to have happen is that when this bend takes place, that everything is on that same plane. I think that's probably as good as it's going to get as far as me showing it on camera, but you need to imagine that this bench, the top of the tool comes out and it needs to be sitting perfectly flat with the top of that tool. Now you might be able to stick a bit of sheet metal under there to try and gauge it, but what we can do is we can gauge it by eye, do the bend, and I'll show you how to tweak it in another video very shortly. But I'll finish off these bends. So the first one was that 40 millimeters, and I've got it marked there with my piece of tape. It's about to fall off, but when you guys get to do it in the workshop, I'll have a bit of paint there and we'll have it scratched in. It just won't show up on the video, so I haven't bothered. Okay, so there's my first 90. Didn't quite get it, so I was going to go again, and then I'm just lining this up, and I'm looking at that plane now, squatting down, having a look through to make sure it all lines up again, and I'll do my final bend, and I've got my piece here. I'll stop this video now and I'll show you how to neaten that up. Okay, so the next part we're going to do, guys, is we're going to put this bend in here. Now on the plan, it calls for 160 degrees to be with our bend there. Now I've figured out a really nice way of just repeating that bend and getting it the same every time, and I'll show you that now. Before we start the bend butt, we want to make sure that our piece is sitting nice and flat. So if you put it on a bench, it should not be rocking and rolling too much at all. And to fix that up, what you would do would be, you can see this one here is sitting a tiny bit high. You'll be able to just give that little tap, little play around, a little tweak until that's all sorted. You might find that when you look at it from this direction, one of the legs is kicked over to the left and the other one to the right, and that might be stopping it from sitting flat. Now that's from not having it sitting exactly in the same plane when you do all your bends. So you can also just give that a little tweak. I'm talking like little taps, not smashing the hell out of it, and getting that nice and perfect. The other thing you can do is you can also use a shifting spanner by tightening it up and twisting in whatever direction you need. You can also use the end of your shifting spanner as a lever to bend these in whatever direction. So you're just going to get this sitting perfectly flat before we get to this next step. I need to find the center of this. So with a ruler, I measured mine to be 64 from outside to outside. So it's 32 to the center. Now I could go and I could measure and mark these, but I know from experience, and this is where the repeatability comes in, I have a little trick that I use instead of measuring each one, because every time I measure I could have a bit of human error. What I'm going to do is I'm going to place my item, my handle in the vise. But before I do, I'm going to get 2 engineering squares that are exactly the same, and I'm going to place them underneath like that. Now, what that is doing, and if I move the camera around you might be able to see it from this angle, it's offsetting exactly the same distance because they're the same square. So it's offsetting that top bar, the thickness of my square, which, either being a fluke or someone's designed this job very well in the past, is puts my bend exactly in the middle of the handle. So we're pretty lucky like that. If it didn't, and I was in industry and I was making heaps of these, I could always rip a block of wood or cut a piece of aluminium or something and use that to space my handle each time. So now that that's spaced and clamped in, I need to perform that bend. So I've got that clamped in, I'm looking at that, it's looking nice and parallel. So to perform the bend, what I'm going to do is, I've got that in the vise, I'm going to take my hammer and I'm going to just give it a blow there and there on that leg, making sure it's nice and tight. And that's starting to bend across, as you can see. And then I've almost got it in place where I'm going to push that across. And what I'm looking for, I've actually gone a little bit too far. I know from experience that the bend works out perfect when the back of my square, where you can just see that daylight coming through, lines up with the jaw of the vise. And I want that exactly the same the whole way along. So the gap's slightly smaller there than it is to here. So what I might do is I might just give this little area here a tap, and then it would be exactly the same. Sorry, this side. Okay, that's exactly the same now. And so that is one handle with that bend in place, ready to be secured to my job.